I was holding her when she died. Yeah, it was hard. He goes, well, sorry to tell you, he said, I'm sure you'd like to come back to Hawaii as the athletic director, but our orders are we're going to hire somebody who's currently an athletic director. Thank you very much for your interest. Boom. Hung up. I was so stunned. I was in kind of disbelief because I think all along I was telling myself that's my destiny. I understand the reason why I've come back, and I think this final chapter of being mayor is I feel like all roads have led to this. My mother was the reason why I came to Hawaii. And I thought, if my mother was alive today, and I asked her, what do you think I ought to do? She would say, you got to do this. She was that way. So I did it in that spirit. We went big. When Matt was born, it was an outbreak of salmonella in the hospital. There was several kids that died. Matt survived. It was the first UH football game that I wasn't coaching. I'm sitting there listening to a UH football game on a transistor radio. I realized in that moment with my son there fighting for his life and the fact that I knew I was feeling sorry for myself, but the reality was the world was going to go on without me. That was a turning point for me. Nothing ever came easy for Ryan. We knew there was something not working with him. And I was sitting down with the neurologist. She said, his brain synapses are not connecting, and he's probably not going to be able to ride a skateboard or a bike. You're going to have to rethink your whole life with this kid. Ryan could ride a skateboard, rode a bike, graduated from high school, graduated from college, did all the shit that they told me he was never going to do, and just kept believing in him and helped him just overcome the odds, which he did on his own, but it was all because somebody believed and loved him. My daughter was a surprise, and the fact that it was a girl was terrific. And just see when Ryan came along and Matt, having a couple of boys seemed very natural. I think you want your kids to feel proud of you. I think she's proud of the fact that I'm taking on such an enormous responsibility. I think that's the fascinating part about when you become a parent. You determine love initially with the person you're in love with, and then suddenly kids show up, and suddenly you have this capacity to love, and then they're also different from each other. So I loved her in ways that she would never know, and I wish I could have made her know that.
Greater Good Radio. Connect, learn, heal, and grow is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaiʻi, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com. Welcome to Greater Good Radio. Today we're with the handsomest man in Hawaii, Rick Blangiardi, the mayor of Honolulu.
Well, we're going to start off with you speaking untruths. I'll accept the role as mayor, yes, but handsomest guy, no, I tell you. But that's okay. I appreciate. I appreciate the kindness.
Okay, so I'm sure you have some recollection of this because we've done this before. Sure. But in the last, I'd say 20 years since it was the last time that we sat down like this, what would you say has been your biggest learning lesson?
Well, that time frame is really relevant. Actually, it's a little bit longer than that. It was in 2002 when I decided to return to Hawaii. I lived on the mainland from 89 to 02. Although I told the press when I first arrived that, I moved to the mainland in 89, but I never left Hawaii. But this last 22 years, I know you asked me about 20, but since I came back in this July of 2002, I came back with a sense of destiny. I came back with a sense of feeling like I was drawn back to this place. And it was almost not so much counterintuitive, but given the things I had done on the mainland, what we had most recently accomplished, which was I was a president of Telemundo, and we sold the company, and I was kind of a hot commodity in the broadcast world, had a lot of options about being up there, chose to come back to Hawaii. And so I've learned so much. I mean, I understand the reason why I've come back, and I think this final chapter of being mayor is I feel like all roads have led to this. And now just having completed our first term in the first 4 years, and knowing what we've done in those 4 years, knowing what we really plan to get done in the next 4, is really a lot of incredible intention and purpose, surrounded by a lot of talented people in a moment in time. I've been in leadership roles for most of my life, but I really feel the responsibility of this leadership role in a way that I've never felt before. And that's not just because of the scale of the city. It really has a lot to do with the moment in time. So what I've learned along the way has been a lot, because so much has happened. And I would tell you that if I had known at the time I was making the decision to move back to Hawaii, what was in store for me, if I even was capable of imagining that, I think I would have been excited through my mind, but I didn't. I just remember deciding that at the time I'd been on the mainland for 25 years. I was single. My kids were grown. I'd buried my dad that last year. He was gone. My parents were gone, and I could make a choice of where I wanted to be in the world. And I just felt strongly about coming back to Hawaii. I was drawn to it. And so I did that. And I actually did it. I took a job to have a job. Actually, there were two things going on. And what triggered my interest in coming back to Hawaii was the athletic director's job was open at the University of Hawaii. A job that I never got because the guy at the time was a president called Evan Dobell, and he had predetermined that he wanted to hire Herman Fraser, even though he had hired a search firm, Eastman Bodine, to conduct a search. The whole thing was a shooby, you know? Okay. But I was hearing from people like the late, great Jim Leahy, Robert Kekala, another, these guys say, you got to come back. This job's for you. Everything he's saying is about you. He says he wants a business guy. He wants someone with connections in town, a guy that knows sports and wants a football guy. But I couldn't get the time of day with Evan Dobell. And not only that, when I applied, I actually hired a guy to make a resume for me. I didn't even have a resume. I paid him $500 because I wanted to impress this search firm. And all I got was a 3-minute phone call from them. I was in the back of a cab. I just landed in Miami, saw they called them back. And the guy said, well, we're here. Eastman Bodine was pre-screening for the athletic director search at the University of Hawaii. So I just have one question, sir. He said, I looked at your resume. Are you currently an athletic director? I said, no, I'm president of a company called Telemundo. And he goes, well, sorry to tell you, he said, I'm sure you'd like to come back to Hawaii as the athletic director, but our orders are we're going to hire somebody who's currently an athletic director. Thank you very much for your interest. Boom. Hung up. I was so stunned. I couldn't believe it. I was in kind of disbelief because I think all along I was telling myself that's my destiny. That really sparked my interest in coming back to Hawaii. I just actually thought that's what I was supposed to do. And with my life, that just made great sense. And at the time, I'd been in broadcast exactly 25 years from the time that I left coaching. And it was an incredible success. I even have an article from Broadcasting and Cable that called it the greatest turnaround in the history of television and what we did with that company and everything else. So that's why I got really excited about Hawaii. But then these guys shut me down. And it just so happened, coincidental during that time, through a search firm, a guy named Brad Marks called me, who was good friends with a guy named Jeff Smulyan. He did a lot of search work for a company called MS Communications and asked me if I would do him a favor. And I said, well, I got this client named Jeff Smulyan, who I heard of and I was aware of. And he said, he's really upside down in Hawaii. They own 2 television stations, KHON and KGMB, where I'd started work. KGMB is in a legal duopoly. They've had a waiver for a couple of years, but that's coming to an end. They've got good ratings on their television stations, but they can't make any money. And he said, he's wondering if you would be willing to sit down with him, because whenever he's asked people around town, who he should be talking to run this thing, he said, my name kept coming up. So I agreed to take that meeting, thinking, wow, this is kind of serendipitous. All of a sudden, I got these 2 potential things in my life about going back to Hawaii. I knew that when Telemundo closed, at the time that I was being contacted, we made the announcement on October 11, 2001 of the sale. That was 1 month to the day after 9/11. We actually would have done it a month earlier, and we had a bidding war, and that's a whole long discussion. So I was in the process when I got the calls. In fact, I got the call from Brad. I remember I was in a limousine being driven back from Teterboro, New Jersey into Manhattan, because our television station was in Manhattan. Our sales operations, everything else was in the city up by Columbus Circle, but I was over at the TV station that day doing due diligence with NBC, and it was in February, and we're trying to get the deal closed. Announced the deal on October 11th, and I was given until the end of 2002, which was about 18 months to make this deal close. So any time that we could do it sooner, it would be accretive to GE. So when you're talking about the kind of money we were, which was a $2.7 billion in cash, $700 million assumption of debt, the clock is ticking. Money doesn't sleep. But there were times when, during those days, I swear to you, I was flying commercial too. It was post 9/11, where I woke up in Miami, worked in Chicago, slept in Houston. Days like that. It just was incredible. And that went on. But we went on 6 months in a day because we closed on April 12th. But anyway, back to the story. I got this call. I'm in a snowstorm in February. And Brad's saying, this guy wants to talk to you about Hawaii all along. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. I didn't make much of it. I thought I was actually going to go to this meeting to help. try to maybe explain, even though I hadn't worked in media in Hawaii in a while, because I used to come back every year. I kind of stayed in touch, even though I was doing other things. And, I went to Seattle initially, and then I was in New York at CBS, and then I came back across country and worked in San Francisco, and then I became president of a broadcast company and was living on airplanes all the time. But I was based out of Sacramento, and our headquarters were in St. Louis. I was all over the country. I doing all that stuff. But I stayed in touch with Hawaii because so much of my life had been here. So anyway, I agreed to do that meeting. And so here's what happened. I'm thinking I'm going to be the AD, but I'll take this meeting. I'm not thinking they're going to offer me a job. I'm going to do it as a courtesy because I had known Brad and actually had used his search firm. And they come in with a guy who was president of the company, this guy named Randy Blangiardi. And he brought a guy with him who was his number 2 guy. Yeah, I can't think of his name right now. And an HR guy. And we're like, where's Jeff? Well, we're here to represent Jeff, and we want to have a conversation with you because we're operating the company, and if that's okay. And I said, fine. I was looking forward to meeting Jeff. I was kind of surprised and was up at Brad's office, which was in Century Center. He had this big suite of offices right in the foothills of Beverly Hills, right, off of Santa Monica, Century Boulevard, right there. Classic LA, right? Big conference room. So I sit down with them, and so we start talking, and and I'm not naive, and I find out what these guys are really trying to do is see if I had any interest in the job. Meanwhile, I'm thinking I'm going to be AD, okay?
Even though they told you that no on the AD one?
They hadn't told me that yet.
Oh.
This was the early stage. I didn't know yet, but I really want to go be the AD. Mm-hmm. So here's what happens. So this is in February, and nothing's really happening with UH. So I get in this meeting, and we're into the meeting for about an hour, and all of a sudden I realize they're asking me, like, what are you going to do when this deal closes? Is there any way you would consider going back to Hawaii? And I said, well, I'm thinking about my options. I said, I didn't tell them anything about being the AD. I said, NBC's talking to me about a lot of things. I do have an obligation to stay on because I want to hire my successor, but I've made it very clear that when we close this, that the company should hire a Latino in my position because for the last several years, I've been going, we were in all major markets, going to all these functions, and I don't speak the language. I speak English. Everybody speaks Spanish until I get up to speak. I know they're bilingual, but I always felt, because I grew up in a bilingual household myself, like I was insulting people by not speaking the language because we were an all Spanish language network. And the whole idea of that was to perpetuate the language because when one identifies with one's ethnicity, it starts with language. And so I always felt odd about that, but I was an operator, and at that time we had 11 television stations. We had 8 initially when I joined, and we bought a second one in LA, duopoly, and we bought one in Denver, and we bought a big one in Dallas. And I was actually negotiating in Phoenix to buy that market. At the time, we were looking to expand. So anyway, we get into the conversation, and then the conversation gets to a place where, well, how would you like to be managed, And I tell these guys...
In the sale already.
Yeah. And I said, well, I tell you the truth, I'm not a guy who wants to be managed. I mean, here I was running Telemundo. We had just finished months prior to making the deal on October, dealing with the top guys at not only NBC, but CBS. Viacom was very much in the mix. It was really with Viacom and GE. It wasn't with NBC and CBS, the guys I was dealing with. And then prior to that, it was with AOL, Time Warner, and the top guys at Disney. Because the first guys in was AOL, and then Disney came in, and the last 2 were CBS and NBC. At one point, we had all 4. And then the first 2 that dropped out were AOL and Disney for different reasons. But anyway, the point is that year I was on the front page of Broadcasting and Cable magazine, 25 to watch in the industry and all this stuff. And I've been operating at a high level. And these guys got me now back. I said, if you're looking for somebody to manage, I'm the wrong guy. In fact, that's actually how the meeting ended. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not that guy. I said, if I do anything, if I'm going to work for anybody, I need to feel like I'm trusted, and that's what I want. Is I want a trusting relationship, and I want the empowerment to make decisions, and that's how I operate. So the meeting ended, not abruptly, but I kind of ended the meeting. In fact, I had a flight to catch out of LA. I remember I went to Washington, D.C. from there, and I went on about my business, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward, I think it was in the month of May, a couple of months go by, and things have really heated up with the athletic directors thing. And I'm thinking I'm going to get this deal closed
So they were talking to you.
Yeah.
The AD search was talking to you?
No, they weren't talking to me at all. No, the thing was going. But we got the NBC deal closed on April 12th. 6 months in a day from October 11th. We got it closed. And so now it's the spring, and I know I'm there. I mean, I've got a really good job in there. And we had done so much due diligence with them now, so after the deal closes, even more so. And I'm dealing with the top guys from GE, and now I'm dealing with all the guys from NBC because we're doing the actual integration, you know, in New York and all of our markets. Dallas, I'm there in that role. And so in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, all these places, right? So I'm that guy. But now the time is heating up. So I'm in Miami. I get off the thing, and this is like in May, and I'm in my job doing it. And so that's when I get the phone call from Eastman Bodine, okay? Like, I'm going to go nowhere. But I refuse to take that as a no. I'm thinking, come on, these guys, they don't know, you know? So a couple of weeks later, we're in New York City. And they hadn't told me definitively no at that point with Eastman Bodine. I was aware of who they were, the search. I had the resume, the whole bit. Again, I was so consumed with my Telemundo responsibilities. They were big, believe me. I was working for 4 private equity guys. Sony was a privately held, but Sony, Liberty Media, which was a big deal at the time in the cable world, and then 2 private equity groups. So that was consuming 20 hours a day. But in my mind, I kept thinking, when we get this done and we get my successor, if this thing works out, because Dobell was talking about, you know, he wanted to get this done, you know, by the summer and all that stuff. And they're all sending me newspaper clippings. So we're at Radio City Music Hall. It's the NBC up front. And I'm there with all my general managers because the deal had been closed a month earlier in April. And they have a stand-up. I remember, I forget, the president of NBC. We were like the darlings of this whole thing. It was a big deal for NBC to make this acquisition and entree into the Hispanic market. This was a big deal. It's a bigger deal today now, 20-plus years later, and what Telemundo represents for them. But anyway, I got a special introduction because I'm president of the company. CEO was on the stage. Jim McNamara was the CEO. I was only the president, but I was the operator, in charge of all the stations and all that responsibility. So we're walking out of Radio City Music Hall, and I run into Randy Baumgarten. And Randy Baumgarten says to me, we'd like to talk to you again. Only this time, we're giving you a lot of thought, and we'd like to have a very different conversation. Are you available? And I said, well, where and when? You know, like that. I didn't want to be rude. I wasn't rude when I ended the other meeting. I wasn't talking about a job offer. But this time, the way he talked to me, and we're at Radio City, you know, some like...
Did he happen to be there, or he was at the same event?
He was there because of the NBC O&O, because he was the president of the company, had a bunch of NBC affiliates. So he sees me, I'm walking out. Yeah. We just finished being part of the stars of the show, along with all the Hollywood stuff that goes on. You know, we're there. Yeah. And it was another meeting. I think it was the CBS meeting the next week in Las Vegas. He said, I'm going to be in Vegas next week. And I said, yeah, I have reason to be there as well. And he said, so you think we could meet? And I said, yeah. So sure enough, I met him at the Bellagio. And we sit down. He said, look, we've given a lot of thought. You know, he said, so I want to be really direct with you. Are you interested in taking a job with us as running both KGMB and KHON? I said, you know, what's the deal? Okay. Mm-hmm. So he told me the deal. And I knew it was not going to be anything like what I was doing. And that's when I said to him, Randy, I wanted to wrap it up with you. You asked me to speak again, but I want to be honest with you. I said, I have a real interest in Hawaii, but I'm going to be the next athletic director at the University of Hawaii. I tell him that, right? Just like that. He goes, yeah. He said, we heard that. But in case you don't become the AD, would you consider this? And at that point, I knew I wanted to go back to Hawaii, and I knew there were some things that had gone on with Telemundo that I don't want to talk about now that they had to do with the money and stuff like that. And I said, I might be willing to do that. So he said, well, how long will it take you to find it? I said, I don't know. I need to get really direct with these people and find out. I've been trying to be patient and go through the thing and the motions, the search firm. So that's when that happened. So I had called them. I got aggressive with it. I knew they had my resume on file. So they called me back. But I thought it was very cool that Randy said, if you don't get that, I left that meeting, then we want to hire you. And at the numbers they were talking about. But at that time, given how I was cashing out at Telemundo, I thought, okay, I'm going to go back. So I left that meeting feeling really good, saying, I know now my destiny. I'm going to go back to Hawaii no matter what.
So they called you and told you no?
I called them, I think even a couple of times, and finally I got a call back. In fact, I tried calling them back after the guy told me, if you're not an athletic director, that we're commissioned, we have to find an athletic director, right?
So up until that call, you had no conversations with them?
No.
You were just waiting, figuring like,
I submitted my paperwork, I wrote a letter, did all of that stuff. I was just waiting to hear from them. But it was after Randy's thing, and that triggered then my getting aggressive with them, and then they called me back and said, if you're not a sitting athletic director, then we're going to hire somebody who's currently an athletic director.
And then you called them again after that?
After I hung up, I was so shocked in the cab. I got back to the hotel. I tried to get back to the guy, and they wouldn't take my call. It was really pretty abrupt. Ironically enough, years later here in Hawaii, I got to be a host at the Chamber of Commerce thing with June Jones, and Bob Bodine was there. He was on one of the 3 panel guys, and the other was June's agent, Lee Steinberg. And they asked me to moderate it in front of a whole group at the Hilton Line Village. So I had a chance to talk to Bob Bodine. I said, because I never even spoke directly to him, but I told him that whole thing. And he said, yeah, that was in the bag the whole time. He said, we got hired to go through the motions, but he wanted to hire Frazier. And he said,
like a red herring.
Yeah, he said to me, but it looks like you did okay for yourself at the time I was back. I said, yeah, I'm back in Hawaii. I said, but I would tell you that I really wanted that job. And in fact, I couldn't even get an interview for it. That's all I was asking for. Give me a chance in a room. The guy was so dismissed. And, my resume was very strong broadcast, 25 years. And I hadn't coached since 1977. And even though I had good credentials as a coach, I was associate head coach and defensive coordinator and all of that, I had no athletic administration. I just had, things we'd done. And plus, I'd spent 13 years being the announcer on air with Jim Leahy, try to get that to give me some weight with a search firm that's looking for an AD. I didn't have enough leverage there. You know what I'm saying? Because they didn't know me and they didn't know what I could do, or even for that matter, I was trying to make the case of what we did with our television package. I wasn't just the announcer with, in the 80s, this whole sports package and stuff to demonstrate something that didn't carry any water.
Yeah, that's the hardest thing, right? Because, I don't know if you know, but I do recruiting. And the tricky piece about it is translating. Because you're translating it, right? You're translating what's presented here in a resume or what's presented as background or so on, and you got to translate it to the person. And maybe they just didn't. Well, plus if you weren't an AD, then you kind of were out.
I was.
They just didn't tell you.
But I didn't know that definitively. All along, I kept thinking, I'm going to get the interview and I'm going to kill the interview. Maybe call arrogance, but I'm going to get in that room, and by the time I get out of that room, they're going to say, this is the guy we want. I just never had that opportunity. Okay.
Does it feel like unfinished business to you, or what? Like this many years later.
Well, let me take you back there. I'll tell you, yeah. It's funny you should bring that up. Yeah, no, so I was glad I came back, and then the rest becomes what it becomes. We take KGMB, and they're both in the nosedive in 3.5 years, and we turn them around. In fact, the KHON, not once but twice, we won the best Fox affiliate in the country. They flew me back to Punta Mita to give me the trophies. And KGMB, we took out of its insolvency, and then 3.5 years into it, US decides to sell all the TV stations, 16. And that's when the FCC, because we were able to extend, I went back and met with Senator Inoue a couple of times, extend waivers on the illegal duopoly without having to divest of KGMB. But when Emma said they were going to sell the stations, the first order of business from the FCC was you're going to have to sell them to 2 separate parties. In fact, ironically enough, in the 16 stations they sold, the KHON went in the first 4. It was that strong because we had not only affiliation, but we had raised the profitability. And the one thing that they met with me initially, they couldn't get done, we did, and we did the same thing with KGMB. And that's when I met Scott, and the news operation. They didn't even have a morning news.
I was with you when you said we're going to start morning news.
Yeah. And Scott Humber was the major architect on that. That was in 2007. But by that time, we had already beaten Joe Moore, which everybody couldn't believe, at the 10 o'clock news on KGMB, and so we were doing some really cool things in the market. So anyway, fast forward, we get through that, and then I don't want to work for the guys at by KHON, and I walk out because even though they said all these nice things, they got me behind a closed room, and they said, look, we paid through the nose for the station, and we want you to lay off 34 people. And I said, I could do that, but I won't do that. And that was a famous thing. So I walked out, and all my managers walked out. And then they tried to stop the bleeding on that, and that became its own drama. But I was going to just walk away from MS. I was upset with them. But they had me on the contract. And they told me I had to go over to KGMB, or they were going to sue me for breach of contract. And not only that, they were going to be very aggressive about it, because they claimed if I jeopardized this deal in KHON, I mean, this would have had a lot of zeros. And I was in no mood to take on a lawsuit like that. It was one thing for me to be principled to walk out of KHON, which they were really worried I was going to blow the whole deal by doing that. And they were going to come for that. But if I refused to work for them at KGMB, it got kind of ugly.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't want the brain damage, and I really had no way to go. I was in Hawaii at that time. I was like, okay, I'll go and help the sale of KGMB. And, there's a lot of good people in KGMB. I got to know them. And all of a sudden, I had gone from running a big group and all those dynamics, 4 years earlier, to having the headaches of running the 2 stations. And then suddenly KGMB, they didn't change my pay. And I thought, okay, and then help lead the sale. In fact, actually tried to buy KGMB. But as a single station, we just couldn't make the numbers pencil out. Mm-hmm. In fact, originally, Jeff Smulyan had, this is really ironic, had put the sale of the station at $30 million, which they couldn't get. We put together a thing to buy it, but we had improved the station so much, he upped the ante to 35. And then I convinced a bunch of guys, this took some time, now this took a couple of years, that we could hit the 35 because we increased our profitability at Cage, and he upped the price to 40. And that was a bridge too far. Actually, quite honestly, the highest we should have paid was $27 million, but I was pushing these guys into this deal, local investors and stuff. Station ended up going for $42 million. It sold for $40 million in cash, and $2 million they left on the table for receivables, which was unbelievable. Anyway, so from a company called MCG, they were private equity guys in Washington, and they were buying us, telling us we were going to be the flagship, and they were going to buy all these other stations. That didn't last very long, and long story short, that ended up being what then 2008 hit. That was in 2007. The recession that brought everybody to their knees. Yeah. Our cash flow dropped substantially. Well, at least we were still in the black. KHON was way down. And so that's what the guys from MCG Capital went to Raycom, who owned KHNL and K5, and they saw a way to make the deal. So there was a serendipity in them buying it, even though they didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were clever enough to see the loophole with the FCC. And that's actually what we did. It had to do with exchanging intellectual property. It was a pretty sophisticated deal, and not anything you really want to talk in detail in this session. But that ended up becoming the then creation, this merged entity that we decided to call Hawaii News Now in 2009. They came, and so we did that, and we had to lay a lot of people off. We had 198 employees. I had to get it down to 30. So we let 60 people go in order to consolidate. I try to keep it, even though we had the better team at KGMB. I want to take everybody. I couldn't quite do that, but we brought our news operation over almost entirely. We brought our sales office over. Some of the other people, backroom stuff, where the redundancy was, like we kept the people in their business office and so on and so forth. We went through that. Then we turned that into an incredible success.
Were you ever thinking in there, like, why the heck did I come back to do this?
No, because I was really grateful that I was back in Hawaii. I got back in touch with people that I hadn't seen in a lot of years. I liked being back in Hawaii. I had a lot of experiences in the 13 years I was gone. Originally in Seattle, then New York City, then San Francisco and Los Angeles. As the cities I lived in during that time. 2 of the jobs I had in those 13 years, I was president of national companies, and I lived on airplanes and saw a lot of other cities, especially with Telemundo. But the other one, too, I was president of a company called River City Broadcasting. We had 9 TV stations and 27 radio stations. I actually had oversight of the radio stations as well. And that was on planes 45, 46 weeks a year.
So it's the relationships that...
Well, I came back to Hawaii. I felt grounded. I'd done that with River City, and then I had an interim thing for 2 years where I tried to launch a cable horse network through Brad Marks, who brought me into the deal, which would have been a tremendous payout. And it just was the time wasn't right. This was all tied to a digital tier, in the analog universe, you can only keep 36 stations. There's a lot of technical stuff I don't want to go into right now. But anyway, it was all entrepreneurial. It was all trying to parlay knowledge and skills into creating something, and so all of that was good. And like anything, you suffer triumphs and you suffer, I wouldn't call them disasters, but you suffer things that didn't happen. I mean, we tried to launch this thing. We had an angel in the project for $5 or $6 million. We had the whole horse industry alliance behind this. It was at that time a $25 billion industry that that didn't have any kind of outlet for lifestyles of horses and stuff. This in equestrian lifestyle, and there was a real niche there for pay cable in select markets with horses and stuff. And we had the same guys, Newberger and Greenberger out of Westlake in LA, same guys that launched the Sci-Fi and the Golf Channel. We had really good venture capital investment bankers, and the goal was to raise $100 million. And because we needed staying power, anyway, it was a worthwhile endeavor.
I'm still waiting to hear if the AD thing felt like unfinished business.
I come back and I'm no longer announcing. I buy my season tickets and I start going to the games.
Okay.
Immediately good season tickets up in the loge, actually next to the press box. So from Aloha Stadium was the same vantage point. And I immediately got myself involved with UH. I got on the board of Koa Nui Nui and NACOA. And so I spent 6 years at Koa Nui Nui Nui, and Brett Kobayashi and I rewrote all the bylaws for that. So it was really a rich experience trying to help the university. And I became the president of NACOA when Ben Yee, who founded it with June Jones, and they're running it out of a shoebox to make it, stepped in and did that for 4 years. So it was supposed to be 2. So I stayed around it. I was a season ticket holder, whatever, and I watched the guys. But I liked my job in broadcast. I met Karen, who's now my wife. There were other things going on in my life. So it was sort of arm's length away. It wasn't the same way I was involved when I'd been back in the 80s when Stan Sheriff was alive, Al Simone was the president, and we not only put the television packages together, I was really intimately involved in getting into the West Athletic Conference. That was because prior to that, it was all pre-WAC, when Dick Tomey was coaching and had that kind of thing. And, when Stan died, actually, I was with him 2 nights before by incredible coincidence in Dallas, Texas, and said goodnight to him. I got out of the cab first. We closed the restaurant. We were with Paul Richards from Wyoming and Orville, whatever his name was, from Colorado State. And I told Stan, you look like crap, man. Take care of yourself. And 2 nights later, he was dead at the baggage claim area. And I got a call in the middle of the night back in New York. And I flew back and did the keynote at his funeral. And then 5 years later, even came back and did the keynote when they opened up the Stan Sheriff Center, when they named it after him. And so I was really close to that, really close in ways. That's why I always figured with Eastman Bodine years later, This is my job, it's my destiny. So anyway, take all of that. I come back, I'm doing that other stuff, but things change in broadcast, the duopoly. I'm getting older, I'm looking at things differently. I see these guys. Frazier was a failure. They hired some guy after him, Ben Jay, the 4th athletic director. They hired him because he was at Ohio State. He was like the number 4 assistant AD, and somebody thought that was a big deal because he was from Ohio State, and this guy never should have been in the job, and that didn't last very long. And the same thing with Frazier.
So if they offer you the job right now, you take it?
Well, let's go back. Okay. So it's 6 years ago, and Karen and I had been together since 2003. We just made 22 years together. Wow. But we didn't get married right away. So she and I got married 6 years ago. 6th wedding anniversary was in September. So now I'm at the Hawaii Executive Conference. Dwayne Carrizo just took it over. You're going to a rebirth of the whole thing. It wasn't just going to be, an expensive weekend where everybody goes and tells each other how great thou art, that kind of thing. He wanted to do it with purpose, and so it was all about rediscovering Hawaii's soul. So Karen and I go over. I'm running Hawaii News now, and it was by invitation only. And I knew Dwayne and a lot of the other people, and so I went to go, not knowing what it would be about. Karen and I just got married. This was in October. And so then they asked me to be in a room in a meeting, and in the room was Dwayne and Keith Amamiya, ironically enough, Mike Akane, bunch of guys, 5 or 6 guys. They say, look, we have a real belief that part of rediscovering Hawaii's soul is the athletic department needs to be a lot better, and we think you should become the AD, and we can make that happen. So I just got married to Karen. I was at Hawaii News Now. There was no talk of selling Hawaii News Now. I was having a good time there. I liked it. But all of a sudden, they brought me back. So, make a long story short, Karen and I agreed. My wife said, as long as I don't have to go to volleyball games on Tuesday nights or whatever, that kind of thing. So I tell them, yeah, okay, I'll resign. I'll take the athletic director on if this is all part of this leadership thing here for Oahu. Huge pay cut, huge responsibility. And so in the interim, I actually get on an airplane on my own expense because they said they had to work it out with now former President David Lasner. I figured these guys could do it. I think Lasner was even at the conference. And I went up and they wanted to find out if there's any chance, and part of this whole thing with the expansion of Hawaii, who was in the Mountain West football, only Big West could possibly get into an expansion of the Pac-12 because there was rumors about that. This is all before the conference realignment started. And there was some potential, they thought, could we possibly get in? And so I went up and I conducted 3 meetings, one with the former athletic director, Dan Guerrero, at UCLA, the dean of athletic directors. Sat down and had a meeting with him, and that was in that meeting that I learned that the possibility that the LA schools could defect. He took me through the whole thing, and a number of years earlier, which I kind of remembered, they tried to expand the Pac-12 to the Pac-16. They tried to get Texas and a couple other schools in there. I forget, but they failed at it. Told me about how bad their television deal was. Told me about how they're not interested in expanding. He said, and we would never go to 13. You have to bring a companion school in. But I can tell you right now, we'll never take BYU. The presidents won't because it's not the research institution. They're not going to take San Diego State. It doesn't have research. This is all before everything else. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to take Vegas, but we've already decided we're going to use Vegas to be the site of our championship play because people like to go to Vegas. They've got good facilities there. This is before the opening of Allegiant, but that was under construction. All of that. So that was that. Then I met with Larry Scott, who basically said, hell no, we're not expanding. He said, I have a lot of pressure. He's a Pac-12 commissioner. A lot of pressure right now to get a television deal. They want a new 25, 30-year deal. He told me they were going to maybe even go with Amazon. At that time, he didn't say Prime, it was Amazon. He said because when we started out, what our last deal was like 20 years earlier, it was pretty good. And everybody's since long passed us by, so the expectations. He said, candidly speaking, this is the cold call. He says that we're going to split the money, man. We're going to split it 12 ways, not 14. And if you guys want to come in for no money, if we had a way to do that, we'd tear it down maybe in a decade. It was like a bad deal. Mm-hmm. Like, in other words, get out of here. But they had me. The third one, I'd rather not say the name, but I met with a university president. And his words to me were, he said, look, I met with you out of respect. Because I told them all, I have no formal authority. I'm here representing a group of businessmen in Honolulu who want to support the University of Hawaii, and they've asked me to be an emissary, if you will, to kind of just do a feasibility. So that meeting didn't last long. It was very cordial, maybe about 15, 20 minutes. I had to fly in to see him for that. He just said to me, I got 2 words for you. He said, wrong president. He said, I'm going to tell you that right now. It's a president's game. This is a president of one of the Pac-12 schools. So good luck. So I wrote up this report. I came back and I reported to these guys. They then asked me to share it with Matlin, the athletic director, and David Lasner. I did. I still remember them being shocked, like, well, how do you know all this stuff? Because the report was detailed. I gave them a lot of information. Mm-hmm. I'm giving you cliff notes right now, all these many years later. And I'm thinking I'm doing it because I'm talking to dead man walking. Lasner's, I got no problem telling him this because he's going to leave. I now know what I'm headed for, and we'll see what we can do about that. So I do that, and a couple months go by after Karen and I agree that I'm going to be the AD, and I'm thinking I'm going to resign from a place I love and was doing well at, but in the back of my mind, this is my destiny. I'm ultimately going to get this job, even though I had a lot of concerns about it. It just felt like this was the leadership challenge, right? I was supposed to do this. I thought I was going to do it however many years ago. I'm going to do it now because I believe these guys. So then one day I get a phone call, I forget what his position was in the Navy, saying Admiral so-and-so is in town. He's here. He's been watching you on TV, do your editorials. He really wants to meet you. And we really appreciate he wants to host you on his barge and there may be a couple other business leaders there, but he really wants to meet you. And I decided, okay, it's the Navy. I'll go. I'll be polite. So I go to this thing, and the only other guy there is Dwayne Carrizo. So we go out on the Admiral's barge. We have a nice conversation. I've not talked to Dwayne since October.
You mean just three of you?
Just the three.
The Admiral
three
and
of
you
us.
two?
Well, whoever was driving the barge and whoever serves the food. Yeah, we're on his barge, right? So we have this whole conversation. And he took us around, showing us all the things he wanted to do. And so now we get off the barge, and they take us up in the car. So Dwayne and I got to walk to our cars. Now, I've not talked to Dwayne since I tell him over on the Big Island that I'm going to take the job. I said, Dwayne, I've been wanting to call you every day. I've been waiting for you to call me. So I just need to know, man, what's going on. You know, I sat there in a very significant moment, made a significant decision, made a promise to you guys. I've not heard from you guys. And he just put his head down. He said, I've been dreading this. I don't know what to say to you. Long story short, he said that Laszlo wouldn't go along with it. He wasn't going to fire Matlin. Basically didn't want any part of me. Didn't, like, you know, I can't say, but Laszlo and I had tense moments to begin with anyway. There was always a certain amount of tension. But anyway, it was like flat out rejection. We just didn't know how to tell you that because you were so willing to do this and give up everything. We're so embarrassed, you know. It was like that. And if you know Dwayne, it's hard for him to admit that because they were so convinced. And so that's how I found out that UH wasn't going to happen, at least by going back to be athletic director. That was a little bit more than 6 years ago. Then what happened after that, you know, was everything began to change. It wasn't, you know, maybe within a year or two, the conference realignments. Sure enough, UCLA and USC were first to leave, and then the other schools followed, and so on and so forth, and NIL, all that stuff. You know, and of course, we go through, you know, COVID. I mean, all this stuff happens, right? And Norm Chow doesn't work as head coach. They fire him unceremoniously. They waited way too long. Rolovich succeeds Norm. That works, but then Rolovich leaves and they hire Todd Grant. I mean, all this stuff. And of course, he doesn't make it, and then they hire Timmy, right? But the point is, I'm not the AD. I'm now doing well at Hawaii News now, and I love my team, but I'm also getting older. And so we go through a sale of the company a year before, and we get bought by a company that currently owns Hawaii News now, that when they bought the Emmis Group, which was at 63 stations, they had 100. They created the third largest broadcast group in America. Gray Media, publicly traded company, 163 television stations. And these guys show up, and they're nice to me because we were successful. And it asked me about what I'm going to do in life, you know, and I could work for them as long as I want and whatever. When I worked for Raycom, and I knew who they were, and I saw how they had a history of micromanaging because KHON and K5 hadn't worked, and they had a group VP in there. But my deal was if we made them the money, you know, I would be able to then leverage that, which we did. They told us they had lost $3.5 million the year prior. We merged the stations. They told me I had to put together a budget, consolidated operations, so it was $7.5 million profit. $7.5 million from a $3.5 million loss. It's a big swing. I purposely made the budget at $8.5 million just to show them, and we came in at 10 something.
Wow.
Okay, it was a $13 million turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
That bought me the opportunity to tell them that the micromanager they had in my midst had to go, and I had to report to the CEO directly. I was the only guy in the whole company. His name was Paul McTeer, and they agreed. So they got rid of that other guy, who was a thorn on all of our sides.
Was that guy here?
No, he was Alabama, but he had been so used to browbeating everybody.
Yeah.
He was the ultimate micromanager. I put up with him, but I didn't want to, but I was caught in the kind of situation, and I thought I could outlive this guy, and that's what we did.
Yeah.
And so we got rid of him, and I was the only guy in the company. I reported directly to the CEO, and I was very comfortable with that, and so was he, because we made them a lot of money. They were in disbelief at the turnaround and what we created in this entity called Hawaii News Now. And not only that, we went from zero to hero, right? We were out there in front of the rest of the company on the digital technology and what we were doing, and all the stuff that they talked about but didn't know how to do, we were doing. And our news operation was, you know, I mean, they couldn't believe the numbers and all this stuff. Honestly, the first time they showed me the stations at Raycom, they had 16 stations. The Hawaii operations were ranked 15th and 16th. And when they sold the company, we were at the top. Okay? That was a good run. So we go to, you know, that was Emmis. And then we go to Raycom. That was my entree. I was feeling really confident. And then had the first year at Raycom, but we turned things around, right? So that was before Hawaii News Now. The chronology is, it's kind of hard talking this way. So anyway, saw that, wanted to stay with my gang. We did. We got rid of that guy. But the point is, all of this is I was getting older. These guys show up and they bring me right back to why I wanted to come back to Hawaii, which was these are guys with dead eyes. These are guys that are just transaction oriented. They have no soul. They shouldn't have bought our station, but that was where the business was going, these large groups. When I joined the business 40 plus years earlier, it was almost romantic how the business was. I mean, when I went to work at KGMB, little did I know, it was owned by an entrepreneur, a guy named Seftel, legendary guy. It went from, you know, single ownership groups like that to small family ownerships to a little bit bigger. Even when I was running King TV in Seattle, the King Broadcasting Company, a really legacy group, was 5 television stations. I went to work for Westinghouse to run San Francisco, KPX, 5 television stations. You know, that was a different era. And went through all of that. But now you get these guys come in, it's all transactional, and they don't care. And they talk about, you know, what can we do to, you know, hub and do things electronically. And I could see it all coming. So I wanted to take our team through the first year because it was going to be tough. And not only that, they went from telling me I could work for them as long as possible to like, when are you going to retire by the end of the year? Like, I had sense of ownership of what we were doing, and I wasn't a yes guy that populated their television stations, the kinds of people like that hire. They acquired me, and I'm at a different level, and I'm pushing back, and they don't like to be pushed back, you know, and I'm trying to be respectful. So I knew it was time to go. A friend of mine, Arnie Klein, that ran KABC in Los Angeles, who retired when he was earlier, before 70, and here I was 73, and I said, Arnie, how did you come to that decision? He goes, you'll know. I never forgot that. And I did know at this point in my life. I loved my team, but it changed. I wasn't going to spend more of my life answering to people like that. It just didn't make any sense. And trying to make them money. It's a different stage of my life. I'm 73 years old. I've been in broadcasting for 43 years.
So you're 73 in that point. So then what made you want to be mayor?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about being mayor, but I knew I had a lot more left in my tank. And I love this place. And I wasn't going to become the AD, right? Oh. Okay? I mean, that was over and done with, right?
I got to tell you, when I keep hearing that feels still sore to me.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I hear Scott in this thing, and I got Scott over there. That's a validation on that.
Yeah. Well, as we record this today, just last night at my home, I had the new UH president, Wendy Hensel. So,
and she said you're going to be the next AD.
No. But I think by the time she left, she wishes I was the AD because she's got a lot to figure out. And I hope that she will by the time, I mean, because they don't have an AD right now. It's an odd time. Given how important, if you will, in the scheme of things, the athletic program fits into a university. And I've been very complimentary. In fact, yesterday's newspaper, I said she didn't take over a broken university, and this is about going from great to greater. And that's true, but the athletic department is not in that same situation. And
you watch on this one. At some point, they're going to say, hey, Rick, we want you to be the AD, but you're still in the mirror. You watch this one, Scott.
Yeah,
I'm calling it.
Actually,
on this one.
Actually, it's actually already come up. But that's
you watch? No, I'm serious.
We've actually had the conversation.
I'm sitting here listening to. I'm thinking, man, this is like.
Well, look, what we didn't say is
universal lesson or something in that. What we
didn't say is that a lot of the reason why I got to live in Hawaii and everything was rooted in my coming here as a player in 1965.
Right.
And then coming back to coach with Larry Price when he invited me in 71 and the years we had together and then what that led to. And, you know, I always had this association with the athletic program as part of my identity here.
Yeah, so we just lure you in with that.
I've always felt that. Well, that's why I was so convinced going back to Eastman Bodine. These guys don't know me. I can't properly reflect what I've done on a resume, even as well as articulated as it was. I need to get in a room with these guys. But anyway, that never happened. So, but my point is that, so at 73, I'm thinking, I don't want to stay around these guys from Gray. Karen and I are talking, and she's retired executive, doesn't have any financial pressures. And she said, look, there's a lot we could do. You can figure it out. I don't want you working for these guys. And when she met them all, she said, are you kidding me at this stage of your life?
Yeah.
But I had such a strong commitment to my local team.
Yeah.
I was really caught, right?
Yep.
So a guy named Clyde Conashero owns Honolulu Waste Disposal. Was good friends with former Governor Linda Lingle. And Governor Lingle wrote him a note and says, you think Rick has any interest in becoming mayor? So I was with him. And he said, Governor Lingle wants to know if you have any interest in running for mayor. To which I say to her, no, I don't have an interest for mayor. Hadn't really thought about it. It was sounded nice, but no. So he told her. So I saw Clyde like a week later or whatever. I said, just curious, did you ever get back to the governor? Because we were both like Linda Lingle. And he said, yeah. I said, what did she say? He said, I'll show you. He holds up his phone. She just said, shucks. She wrote one word, shucks. I tell Clyde on a whim, I'll have dinner with. Let's talk about it, okay? And Scott's in the room here. He knows I didn't like these guys from Gray. I mean, they were guys I wouldn't even hire. Now I have to answer them. I mean, this was worse than going back all that many years ago when I got in front of the guys from Emirates and they said, how do you want to be managed?
You didn't want everyone telling you what to do?
Well, it's not that. It's, you know what? No, you got to respect the guys. I'm a team guy. I pride myself in leading. I can follow too, but I got to respect the guy I'm following. And if I don't, I short circuit. Okay? I don't think I'm alone in that.
Right.
And that's what this was.
So you go dinner with Linda.
I go to Linda, and so she spends 3 hours in telling me why I owe it to Hawaii to run for mayor. Not only that, the dinner ends. She said, I'm coming over tomorrow. She said, I'm coming over to your house. We got to finish this. She came over and spent another 3 hours. So in the course of 24 hours, I had 6 hours of Linda. And she brought a guy who could be my campaign manager. She said, Rick, she's telling me, because she was a 2-term mayor. It wasn't about good, but she was pitching me on what was hitting me with respect to what the city needed and deserved and should be, and you should do all this stuff. And that was late.
Yeah.
That was in December of 2019. It was really late. I mean, Amamiya was already running, and that was the catalyst. Yeah. And the other rumblings about who might run. And so I said, like, okay, I need some time to really mull this over and think about it. And I'll tell you, for a lot of reasons. First of all, the reality. I talk not a lot on this, but to myself maybe, about being intellectually honest. You have to be intellectually honest to yourself. And so now here I am at a crossroads at 73 with a wife saying, hey, you can just retire. It's not about the money, and we can go do things. But I have to sit there and say, okay, if I decide to do this, do I have it in me? I mean, first of all, I'm going to go from being involved with something that I know a lot about. Not that any 2 days were ever really the same. They never were on television. I think that was part of the seduction. But I knew the business pretty much, and no matter how crazy things got, pretty much knew my way around. It could help us get out of situations or create things or whatever. And suddenly I knew I'd have to go into something I knew nothing about.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a real challenge, right? And I was liking it to the fact that once upon a time I thought I could learn Italian, and I realized I couldn't learn Italian. I couldn't learn Spanish. I tried to. I used to fall asleep. I get in these planes, I put the headsets on, with the language things. When I was running Telemundo, I'd fall asleep. I mean, because I was just...
So what was the other language in your household?
I grew up in an Italian household.
Oh, okay.
But I grew up in a generation where they didn't want to speak in Italian.
Oh.
My grandparents came to America, and they changed their names. I just said their Italian names last week to English names. My mother had an American name. My father's Salvatore, because he was the oldest. My mother was the youngest. Her name was Rose. It was kind of an Italian name. But they named the kids. They gave us American names. They didn't want to speak in the language. Everybody came to America to be Americans, and they wanted us to be Americans. So it was like that. It was that generation, It's hard to explain, but that was the 50s. I was born in 46. Let's go back to 73 here. So anyway, I said, let me think about it. And I was thinking about my competitive juices were going. And I'm trying to tell myself, yeah, I can do this a little bit. So it was on Saturday, December 27th. And I already floated it by a couple of people. Told them I'm thinking about doing it. I got mixed reactions. I think I got a mixed reaction from Scott. I think he raised his eyebrow like, I'm thinking about it. And so it was actually the day I made the final decision was on December 27th. Mm-hmm. And so this is going to sound corny, but I say it out of great respect and love for my mother. On December 27, 2019, my mother would have turned 100. But my mother died young. She died at 70. She had an accident. And my mother was the reason why I came to Hawaii. I wasn't going to come to Hawaii. I was in a prep school for the Naval Academy after high school to please my father. Realized that was a mistake. I had a full scholarship to go to Boston College, which is where I wanted to go out of high school until the Navy started recruiting me. And so, but my mother wanted to come to Hawaii, but not without me, the oldest son. My father had a chance to work at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. But my mother was the dreamer in my family. So my mother was the youngest. I grew up in a tenement house. My mother had 5 sisters, 2 brothers. So we lived in the same building, all of us. 3-room flats, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, bathrooms, toilets on each floor down the hall, bathhouse up the street, Metropolitan District Commission, MDC bathroom. Until I was 12 years old. And bilingual household, they spoke mostly Italian when we were home, but they didn't want to speak it on the street, and I didn't really understand it anyway. It was sort of like that. But my mother was the visionary. My mother used to say, you're going to go to college someday. And I had all older cousins, and nobody was talking about going to college. They're talking about, going to trade school, dropping out, joining the military. I mean, their horizons were sort of like that, because all my uncles all fought World War II, and so that seemed to be like, I'm going to either get a job, trade, start working earlier to help the family, that's where the bar was set. And that's kind of what happened, right? Actually, as a kid, he lived in East Cambridge. I used to take a bus, a city bus, every day until I was 12 in the 7th grade when they moved from the 1st grade to the 7th grade. I used to take a bus from East Cambridge to North Cambridge to go to school with a bunch of Irish kids because my mother thought all the Italian kids in my neighborhood were going to be juvenile delinquents, and she didn't want me to be one. So it was like that, but I did that. And so I sat there on that day, knowing full well the reason why I came to Hawaii was because of my mom. And I thought, if my mother was alive today, if she was here and I asked her, what do you think I ought to do? Remember now, she died at 70. I'm already 73. She would say, you got to do this. You got to do it. She was that way. So I did it in that spirit. I made that decision thinking, I'm going to try this. If it works, But in the legacy of my parents, knowing who they were and how the whole thing about Hawaii came to be, in that spirit, I just felt the clock was ticking anyway. But I remember thinking that, and I made that decision. And so I let them know, and then I actually left Hawaii pretty abruptly a couple of weeks later, January 15th. And then on February 12th, we announced. Then on March 7th, we had our first case of COVID. And by the end of the month, it was lockdown, right? It's crazy back then. But I made that decision, and then it began. And then it was a matter of, I think back about it, I feel like I said at the outset today, like all roads led to this because, look, right away, as soon as we announced it was that opposition, this guy's too old, what does he know? He did some editorials on TV, but, that kind of thing. I had some visibility around town, knew a lot of people. If you looked at Mayor Caldwell, he'd been managing director, city council, everybody had all these histories, if you will, of pedigree, if you will, in city government, and here I was coming at it. The only thing I had going for me at the time was Mia had none of that. But before you know it, Kimberly Pine was in the race, Mufi was in the race, Colleen was in the race. So now you've got a former, congresswoman, you've got a former mayor, you've got a city council person who thinks she's, So as it turns out, we get through the primary, and my life from March through August was never-ending series of Zoom calls. I was doing 5 and 6 a day no less than 5, every now and then 6, depending. People were locked down. So, and so some of these were being set up sometimes. There's only a couple of televised debates. I don't know how many. I bet it was over 20 or more with the other candidates. And my competitive juices started going. I mean, I started getting up for this thing, you know? I mean, from the standpoint of listening to what they were saying and thinking, you know, shit, I mean, I may not know what they know. It was really clear to me. I got in touch pretty quickly with what I didn't know, but I'm bringing some other stuff to the party here, you know? So it got very competitive because, you know, it wasn't really debating. People were watching us and were being challenged, and when we had all of us on, they were put on by the hotels and unions and stuff like that. You know, you get into it. So we won in the primary. We won big, and it was just me and Amamiya. And we won by 20,000 votes, I think, in the primary. It was in the general election, we beat him by 20 points. And so once it became me and him, I felt confident we were going to win. Because I won in the primary. I was number one guy. And so we did that. We won in the general election 60-40, and that, to me, at that time, was a bit of a referendum. Like, we're going to bet on you. We're still in COVID. And candidly, we didn't inherit a good situation. And the first order of business was to put together a cabinet in the middle of, I mean, think about where we were the first week of November 2020. We've been locked down since March. There wasn't any talk of vaccines even coming on board. We didn't know where we were going. Now I had to put together a cabinet. Unlike I knew my way around television stations on hiring a news director or a sales manager, and even then it was never a perfect science. Now suddenly I'm going to hire for positions that I remember looking up, and I had to say, okay, we need one of these and one of the, I mean, you know, for titles and jobs we didn't focus on coming in. So, you know, everything was really, really new to me.
Was there a point where you're like, ah, man, why did I do this?
No, never.
No.
I kept being drawn to it. I mean, there were times when I'd get off of Zoom calls, and especially sometimes against the other ones. I had total confidence. I had total confidence going into the primary. I mean, my confidence, even though I didn't have this particular as a job, no. So Karen helped me, my wife, a lot when she said, let's open up a portal. And she knew Mark Wong, who at the time was head of IT for the city. They'd never done that. I knew who I wanted to be my managing director. I knew I wanted Mike Formby, because after we beat Colleen in the primary, she came over to support me. Mike kind of came along with that, and I began to see he and I could really work well together. And I knew if there was a budget and fiscal guy, this guy, Andy Kawano, that I had known, that my wife, when she was chair of the Hawaii Pacific Health Board, he was on her board, and I got to know Andy over the years because she did that for 9 years. I really always liked him, really smart guy, but he was a big executive at Foodland, but I knew who I wanted. Sure enough, I got him at the right time. But we opened the portal, and we had to close it down in 10 days. We had 550 applications. So then I put together a team of 18 people for the transition team, 3 teams of 6, to vet all the things. I had to go negotiate with the Hawaii Prince Hotel to open up and give me 3 ballrooms because they were all closed. But I needed a place to interview these people, and we did that. And we wanted to interview 6 deep for every position. We had 26 cabinet positions. I pretty much knew we were going to retain very few from Mayor Caldwell's team for a lot of reasons. And so that's what we did. So they interviewed from morning till night on a Friday and a Saturday, and morning till night on a Friday. And on the 4th day, the Saturday, is when they presented to Mike and I. Now, we sat in on some of the interviews. We didn't interview anybody. And so then they presented to us. They weren't able to interview 6 deep and everything, but we wanted 3 deep at every position of the 26 cabinet positions. And they did where they could. In some cases, only 1 and 2. And so looked at the first round draft picks, liked about half of them, a little bit more, called them all up. They accepted the job that Sunday, the next day. There were some people, Mike and I both thought we wanted to see who they ranked number 2. And we called up some of them, and then Mike and I interviewed them. We were working quickly, and we hired a couple of them. A couple we went back to number 1s. We put together a really good cabinet. We only kept 3. And then I told these guys, for expediency's sake, but also because of the circumstances, because of COVID and all of the uncertainty, I said, I want you to pick your deputies. There's no political appointments. One of the things that happened that was somewhat serendipitous, if you will, when COVID came and closed us down, I couldn't do any fundraising. So I was rolling my life savings while running for mayor at the same time.
So you wanted to do it. You were serious.
I was more than serious. There's nothing casual about it.
You mentioned that all roads led to mayor. right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. If you did become athletic director, you still think all roads lead to mayor?
No. I'd be the AD today. Yeah. I'm convinced if I'd been the AD, the UH wouldn't be in the situation it's in. I've watched it. I've watched it very sadly not be led the way it should have been led. I've watched the lack of decision-making, the lack of courage, the lack of engagement of the community, et cetera, et cetera. I'd be the AD today. I'd be the AD until I either died or somebody told me I had to retire. But I would have been the AD.
Why is AD so important to you? I mean,
Well, I've always loved sports. And look, sports is, I talked about my mom, but sports is how I got to go to college.
but why the AD?
When I was getting my master's degree at the University of Hawaii in 1972 in educational administration, I knew I wanted to be a head coach and an AD. That was always it. I left coaching, even though I was the associate head coach and defensive coordinator. I was a pretty good coach for economic reasons. But, I've always stayed around the game and all those years of sports, and I always thought I'd like to run an athletic department. I mean, I didn't think that was crazy. I mean,
But only at UH?
I think the only place I felt like, if I had stayed in coaching, I would have gone on to coach somewhere. I think I would have been a head coach, and we're probably a pretty good school. I don't know what kind of success we would have had. I was pretty good at that, and I think that, would have taken on its course. And I mean, I would like to have been an AD. I could have been an AD at a big university, I think, at some point. I think if I'd stayed in that business, I mean, I think it's interesting. I did an interview for an LA magazine years ago when I was at Telemundo, and they said, so if you could pick any job in America, so what would you pick? And it just came out. I said, head football coach at Notre Dame. It was always in me. I don't know how to say it. I mean, that just kind of came out, but I kind of maybe paused. So no. But I've had such a great connection with Hawaii. In all those years of when Jim and I were doing the games. I mean, that was like incredible. You talk about great times of your life, and I knew the impact it was having and the listenership, because I've loved Hawaii. And so I would have been okay even at UH because it's a great university,
Okay. So if you had like a genie in the bottle,
Yeah.
and genie comes to you and says,
Yeah.
okay, Rick, I'm going to give you a chance to go back.
Yeah.
And you can either become the AD at UH at any point in time when you had chosen,
Yeah.
but you cannot become mayor.
Yeah.
Or you
Back
take
then,
the path.
I would have
No,
taken,
but looking at it right now, this is your
AD.
well,
AD then, wait a minute, AD then. Different times because life changed. But that said, this is where I'm supposed to be. And I'll tell you how I summarize this job. Okay. I've learned to put it in just a couple of words. This is the privilege, challenge, and responsibility of a lifetime. Okay? And so I have a sense of destiny. So this is the job. Okay? But back then, I had no political ambition. But I liked the challenges, the dynamics of hiring really good coaches, creating winning teams in all sports, not just football. But certainly football was big. I liked that. I still do.
You ever heard John DeFries talk about koho'ia?
No.
So koho'ia is, this is my interpretation of, is basically like what the universe has in store for you, regardless of whatever you think you have in store for you. It's like being voluntold, in my word, like being voluntold by the universe. Do you feel like maybe mayor is kind of your koho'ia? Yeah. And all roads kind of lead to there.
Yeah. So in some ways, that's why I didn't get the AD job.
There you go. Yeah. It's like, why did this happen for me versus why it happened to me, right?
Why. Yeah. So that's why I don't have any animus towards anybody. And then to win the way we win. And this is a credit to my team, because I said to them in the moment that it happened, I ran, but we won. We just made history together. We won the August primary with nearly 80% of the vote, virtually unopposed. And that in and of itself, the fact that other people didn't decide to run against us was unprecedented of any consequence. There was some other people out there that garnered some votes because they would have voted for anybody but us because we weren't running a popularity contest. But to win in the primary as an independent in this day and age, given the fact that we had such a challenging first 4 years because of not only the program that we inherited on so many different fronts, departments, et cetera, but the whole first year was COVID. I've joked recently that I should ask for a red shirt year for that first year. You shouldn't even count it because it was nothing but COVID. I mean, it really was. It was an incredible distraction. And because we were under the aegis of the state who controls the Department of Health, it was interesting entree into being in a government role, if you will, because there were so many dictates that we're not dealing with today operationally that just were in place.
So if you could have entered into them being a mayor without the COVID piece and without that kind of trial by fire, would you have taken that? Or would you take it what you got?
Looking back, well, think about COVID where so many people were so adversely impacted. So I can't just make it about me. I wish COVID never happened.
Without people getting, injured and so, you know what I mean? But like just your own personal development.
It made the challenge greater,
Yeah.
So I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay. I tell you, this is why when you ask me about the AD thing, I have no regrets in my life. I have none. I have a real sense of purpose right now. And I want to fulfill that. We've sometimes talked about this, just tell our kids when they were playing, what you give is what you keep and what you save is what you lose. Mm-hmm. I know how fast this last 4 years have gone by. I feel fortunate to be strong and good health. I suspect the next 4 years are going to go by even faster. And I just even said today before I came to this taping, I have a real sense of urgency about making a lot of things happen. That is very gratifying. There's a lot of personal satisfaction in being a responsible role like this that can be a difference maker. Recognize that and then do something about it. Pivotal guy was Larry Price way back when.
But everybody, like your parents.
Oh.
If you could only remember one person in your whole life.
Yeah. Well, it's really a blend of my mom and dad because of who they were. It really is. I mean, they were very different people. Probably never should have gotten married. But, my dad, born in 1923, shining shoes in the street at the age of 7 in 1930 during the Great Depression. In 41 at 18, as a kid, he joins the Navy because of Pearl Harbor. Comes back from that 4 years later, marries my mother, works his ass off for the rest of his life as a machinist, which is how he came out here. Blue-collar guy, tough, just, probably at a different time, different circumstances, could have done a lot with himself, but just never had those opportunities. But he never complained. He worked his whole life through. My mother was a dreamer. She had an 8th grade education, youngest of 7 that lived. She just was like that. And so she was a heavy influencer. It was a kind of a combination of my father's toughness and my mother's dreaming and all of that said you can go and do these things.
So if you could only take one memory of your father, what would that memory be?
Wow. Believe it or not, I remember his reaction the day we won the state championship when I was a senior in high school. I was captain of the team. I did something for him in that moment. For a guy who wanted to but never really had the opportunity to achieve something. And then that led to the whole thing with why I went to Navy, because that was kind of a real validation for him. I remember feeling that. My playing prior to that wasn't the same thing, but that year, going undefeated, going that game, it was like, I think I did something that he could relate to, that he knew was a great thing, but he'd never been around anything like that. I remember my father was kind of stoic, but I remember the way he hugged me that day. I remember that.
And how about for your mom?
It's painful because I was holding her when she died. Yeah, that was hard. That was the last thing, she said, "I love you, Rick."
That's a tough piece, right? My mom passed away 2 months ago. So, something else, when that happens.
I just said to somebody the other day who lost their father, until you've lost your parents and you've actually gone through that, when you say you're sorry, it's one thing, but when you've gone through that, you realize how life-changing that is, It's a profound loss in its own way. I mean, if you had the benefit of being loved by your parents and that love, I know there are people who, whatever, but for me, I always had great respect for them. They honestly did the very best they could do. And it was all in that struggle that I really valued and appreciated who they were and the limitations, or the inhibitors that they had to overcome. They did a lot.
How about for Karen? One memory you could keep.
Wow.
And everything else disappears.
Yeah. I think it was the day I met her. The day I met Karen, and it's going to sound corny, at a moment when I really least expected to meet anybody. I didn't come back to Hawaii looking to find a girlfriend, or not even thinking about that, or somebody, or ever get married again. And I met her, and was being through a friend who thought we should know each other. She was going to move back to Hawaii. She was here building a home. I'd come back. He had a lot of respect for the work I'd done on the mainland. He thought a couple of people who were leading big organizations should know each other, because she had asked him to introduce her to some people when she was going to come back, because she had no network. She'd been out of Hawaii for 20-something years. The day that I met her, I had a really strange feeling about meeting her. It wasn't because it was romantic. I just sort of knew she was coming into my life. And I was late for the lunch. I was sweaty. I didn't dress up that day thinking, hey, I'm going to go meet the girl I'm going to marry, whatever. When I met her, we just really connected in a very different way than any other woman I'd known. And I remember thinking that. In fact, I'll tell you just a little anecdote on that. So we met, and she had to go back. She was president of Schwab. She was going to wind down. She was going to retire in April. Met her in January. And so a couple of months later, she gave me her phone number. My son was working in San Francisco, my oldest son, Matt, with Wells Fargo. I was going up to see him to help him. And I thought, hey, I'll call Karen. We had a nice lunch together. That's what we had. And I called her, and she got on the phone. But I said, hey, I'm going to be this weekend seeing my son. And she said, nah, I'm sorry, I won't be here. But I just didn't feel right about that. I thought, okay, well. So after we hung up, because it felt like, I thought, well, okay, I guess I was thinking the wrong thing as it was. But I went up and saw my son. But I remember she was moving back April, and I was coming back one night. I was driving back from Waimanalo. I bought my house, and I was landscaping my house. Was out in the nursery all day. It was a beautiful early evening coming back, and remember she told me she was going to move back, and it was right around that time. I thought, well, I had her phone number. It was in the ashtray in my car, on the back of a card. So I called her. She just came into my mind. I said, hey, it's Rick Blangiardi. She said, I can't believe you're calling me. I didn't know what was going to come next. I said, yeah, you said you were going to move back. She said, I'm sitting here in my hotel room, actually writing you a note at this moment, telling you I'm moving back to Hawaii, and I just want to let you know that. And she's like, I can't believe you just called me. So this had this feeling of kismet, That was totally different than when she blew me off a couple of months earlier when she said, I'm going to be out of town, which, by the way, she didn't go out of town. She just said that. She said she had so much stuff going on with Schwab. She had no capacity to even see anybody on a social thing, which I understand and respect, but she wasn't. So, but it was like, wow. So I said, okay, I'll call you in a week or two. She was going to go stay at her brother's house, wasn't ready, and that's what I did. And then we started seeing each other very gradually, maybe once a week, off and on for a while, for a number of months. But I think when I first met her, I had that strange feeling like, okay, you showed up. I've kind of been waiting for you to show up. I didn't know who you were, but I had that sense of connection with her. And we're very different people. But I just did. I didn't know then, as it was, we didn't get married till 6 years ago. We were, friends and lovers for 15 years prior to, if you will. Yeah, took a while.
It's like I've been waiting for you.
Yeah, and I could say this about Karen. I really wish I'd met her a long time ago. We both would have been different. We'd be different today in a way as a couple. It's love at a different stage, right? If I had any regrets, I said earlier I don't have any regrets. It would have been nice. It would have been nice. More than nice. It would have been terrific to have started out in life with the person who I had children with. But this never would have happened with Karen. But to have that same person in my life, because what happens at this stage of life is your life is segmented by those relationships. And so, my kids are part of my life, but they're cut off in a sense too, because there isn't that same continuity as if I was still with their mother. That's one of the things, if I could change anything, I wished that happened, because I think there's tremendous benefit from a holistic standpoint on how you feel and how you can address that, because you both journey together. You both parented those kids and all that they did to grow up. My kids are 47, 44, 39. They're adults, right? I mean, big people. Not that it's a disconnect, but Karen wasn't part of any of that. And so it's disjointed in that way. I just wish it could be more fluid,
Uh-huh. So you have 3 kids?
3. Matthew, Ryan, Laura.
So if you could only have one memory of each of them.
Oh.
We'll go Matthew first.
I was born, my first son when he was born, and I knew we were going to have a boy. But, I think right from the get-go, that whole thing about I'm really actually a father, I mean, that's a big thing in your life. I mean, and actually in anticipation of coming, he's the reason why I left coaching, because Kathleen was pregnant and we weren't making any money when I was coaching. I was making $15,300 a year, and the whole thing, reason why I went to college, much less graduate school, I was associate head coach and defensive coordinator making $15,300 a year, and that was $3,000 more than my assistants who were all making $12,000. Dom Capers was on my staff making $1,000 a month. I mean, that's what we were getting paid. So I, rather than take a mainland coaching job, decided to reinvent myself and stay in Hawaii because my then wife hated it. I was going to be a father. All the ideals comes with that. So when Matt really showed up, in September, it changed a lot. The reality of his being in the world. The one thing is about you're going to have a baby, but not you really have a baby, That was a real shift for me. In fact, his birth, I would tell you honestly, in retrospect, I resigned from coaching on March 4th, 1977. And I started on March 7th at KGMB on a Monday. I resigned on a Friday. I spent the first 6 months, I had such a strong identity as a coach and my connection with the community and everything else. And I really felt sorry for myself. I mean, I didn't go into TV sales and suddenly decided to take off. I went around going places, feeling bad that I was no longer coaching and the big sacrifice. This is the memory. When Matt was born, he had some jaundice and he had to stay in the incubator. He was very healthy. He was born 3 weeks early, but he was 7 pounds, like 12 ounces. But he had this jaundice and we had to put him on these bilirubin lights. There was an outbreak of salmonella in the hospital. There was several kids that died. Matt survived, but I was sitting there. This is a God's truth that sounds like it's out of a movie. On a Saturday night, it was the first UH football game that I wasn't coaching. There he was in the incubator in his diaper, all hooked up. Only lights in the room, like in a nursery, were the lights from the bilirubin lights in the incubator. And my then wife had her hands in there on him. She had fallen asleep out of exhaustion. I'm sitting there listening to a UH football game on transistor radio. And they're introducing the players, most of whom I had recruited, going to play for Dick Tomey. I realized in that moment with my son there fighting for his life and the fact that I knew I was feeling sorry for myself, but the reality was the world was going to go on without me. It was in that setting that I said some things to myself about growing up. I was 30 years old. And in fact, it was only a few days before turning 31. Matt was born September 4th, and then September 15th was my 31st birthday. So that was a turning point for me. It really was. And I was determined that I was going to go forward and make something of myself. The rest of it became what it became.
So if this was the last time you could leave a message to him, what would you say?
Oof, come on, you're punishing me today. I mean, it's sort of what my mother said to me. I love you, Matt, as only a father could love a son. And I hope that you realize what that means since you have your own son. It's just as deep and as profound as it gets.
I felt that. How about the second child?
When I was in the second grade at Kahala Elementary, we knew there was something not working with him, And so we had all these tests done. And I was sitting down with the neurologist telling me that he was going to be challenged from a learning standpoint. He had severe learning disabilities. And she said, I'm not even sure, if this kid comes home with a C, you better hug him. His brain synapses are not connecting. And he's probably not going to be able to ride a skateboard or a bike. He may not get out of high school. You would have to rethink your whole life with this kid. Ryan could ride a skateboard, rode a bike, graduated from high school, played football in high school, graduated from college, did all the shit that they told me he was never going to do. But nothing ever came easy for Ryan. My then wife couldn't deal with him because he was kind of an imperfect kid. She had him in a school for deaf and blind kids. We had since divorced, and so I had him come live with me and took him out of that and just kept believing in him and helped him just overcome the odds, which he did on his own, but it was all because somebody believed and loved him. And so for me, it was a long journey with Ryan. He just left last year. He back with a sweetheart of his from college, and so I'm really relieved. But yeah, Ryan was special schools, pathologist, neurologist. People teach him how to speak, a lot of stuff like that.
So if we go into that a little bit, maybe one moment you remember with him that's the most meaningful to you.
Oh, there are a lot of them, because when he was a little boy, I remember I said he could ride a skateboard and a bike and stuff. He was playing a little league and he was pretty good. Actually turned out to be a pretty good little tennis player when he was younger. He seemed to defy, all this stuff that, when they tell you that stuff. I think one of the things that I really remember was up at St. John's Berry Academy. I put him in a boarding school because I had this job running River City Broadcasting. He had moved in with me. He did his 8th grade with me. So I did the research on schools that could help kids with special learning needs and stuff. And this school tucked away up in St. Johnsbury, Vermont was one of them. And we went back there to visit it together and put him in this boarding school. And years later, he graduates that day, being up there. And I'd gone up to see him up in Vermont, 43 miles south of the Canadian border. We got his diploma, we did it, because he knew what he was up against. And he got into colleges too, and he graduated. So he figured it out. But I remember him saying, we did it, Dad. Wow, it's sad because Ryan would be a great dad, and it's too bad in a sense, because I think if he had a son, he would, I would say to him, I couldn't have loved you more. Could not have loved you more, Ryan. God bless you. Yeah.
Okay. And then your daughter.
My daughter was a surprise to start out with. And it was great to have a girl.
She knew that before, right?
Well,
before you just said it.
Yeah, she was a surprise.
Yeah.
Well, we weren't thinking of having a third child. That wasn't in the offering. And the fact that it was a girl was terrific. I never thought about it. Just seemed when Ryan came along and Matt, and having a couple of boys seemed very natural. I never saw myself being the father of a daughter. I didn't have a sister, and so that was a big deal. And Laura was, in so many ways, she was easy. She was big. She was 11 pounds at birth. She had teeth at 3 months, and her hair was growing fast. She walked at 9 months. She was smart. She was all of that. Today, she's a mother of 4 kids.
If you could take one memory,
Laura?
You and her.
Oh, boy.
You and her. One memory.
Yeah.
And that's it. Every other memory is gone.
Wow. There's those memories when she was too little that she wouldn't remember. I'll take the last memory when she came out here and surprised me for my inauguration. The look of pride in her eyes, my being her dad, said a lot. I know she was even going to come. He knew. I didn't know she was coming. I think you want your kids to feel proud of you, and, if you can, and to be at this stage now at 78 and doing what I'm doing. I think it's kind of blown her away. She's 39, mother of 4. I think that my longevity, if you will, and staying as active is involved and is giving her a whole different perspective on what she has to look forward to, because she's, with 4 kids right now is kind of clamped down, but there's a big future out there. And I think more than anything, I think she's proud of the fact that I'm taking on such an enormous responsibility. I try to be the best father I could to her, but I'm also a good guy. I think she respects that. She takes a lot of pride in that.
So you were mentioning, you said the memory you were thinking of was before she would remember. What was that?
Oh, I just, I think when she's a little girl, I still remember when we went to the Empire State Building. She must have been 3 years old. I had to carry her up every one of those stairs. I carried her up to the top of the Empire State Building and down. I still remember like that. Wow. It turned out to be not easy task, but I did. It was fascinating when she was a little girl. Just in that toddler thing or whatever, just, those years. Fascinating. And the way a little girl like that will come up to you and your dad, it was very different than the boys. And the way they'll,
Name one. The one that moves you the most.
Actually, it's a negative. It's when I left her mother. She was 4 years old. The way she was crying. If I could go back, I couldn't live with her mother, but I'll tell you, I know I really caused a lot of pain to my daughter. That was hard.
So if you could go actually back in time to that point,
yeah,
and tell her something, what would you tell her?
Well, I don't know, because I tried to at the time. Well, how do you tell a 4-year-old you're leaving? That's why I said what I just said about in this moment, all that many years later. I've always felt like I really disadvantaged her, not being there to be her real dad. My ex-wife remarried less than 2 years later. I was married to a guy for 25 years who died a few years ago. And, that was her stepdad. And my daughter really wanted to have her dad. And because I was away and then subsequently lived away, I never had the years with her. When I think back about the few years we had before I left and what that was like and how special that was. We both lost on that deal, but I couldn't stay with her mother. I had already stayed with her mother long enough with the 2 boys. That's why I said Laura was a surprise.
So if you could leave her one last message, something that she'll keep with her.
Yeah.
That she can reference.
Yeah.
What would it be?
I think of her as an extraordinary woman. I just tell her that. An extraordinary woman. And I try not to position with regret. I would have loved to have been with her. I think she would have been a different person if she had grown up with me. In fact, she and I have talked about that. She talked about how she didn't study in high school the way she should have. She got through school really well. She went to a good school and went to DePaul instead of Northwestern or whatever. Her lack of confidence. Her grades could have been better, but she still had really good grades, but she could have done better. She would have been more focused. She would have been different. She didn't get that from me. I wish I could have been there for her in all of her years. She did okay for herself, too. She really did. But I think I could have done a lot more for her than I did. I made sure she went to the best schools that she could get into, had all that stuff. But it's not that stuff. It's the stuff in between.
Yeah. So without all of that stuff, if she's not going to see you again,
yeah,
and this is the only thing she can reference,
yeah,
and this is your last shot,
yeah,
what is it that you want to say or express?
I think there's a consistency there as a parent. I think that's the fascinating part about when you become a parent. You determine love initially with the person you're in love with, and then suddenly your kid or kids show up, and suddenly you have this capacity to love, and then they're also different from each other. So I loved her in ways that she would never know, and I wished I could have made her know that, or something to that effect. I think I just, I have a deep hole over the fact that knowing Laura and the way I see her mothering, I'm really so proud of her. I mean, I really watched her last week. She was out here with her 4 kids. I could have been that in her life growing up, formative-wise, as her dad. I've loved her with that sense of guilt almost, She deserved that. She deserved that. I should have been there for her. So.
The last one is going to be, if you can give a message to yourself, everything was wiped out, you can't remember it, all you could see was this message, what would it be?
Wow. Well, I've always been inspired, and since Scott's in the room, I've told him about years ago reading the George Bernard Shaw quote, which I'm paraphrasing. It's a servant leadership thing, but he talks about, the harder I work, the more I live, the more I love. And then he simply says, because I want to be used up when I die, I'm going to say, this is really all-inclusive on everything I've done my whole life, is that, I gave it my best. I tried my best. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to acknowledge you, Rick. When we first did Great Good Radio, you were one of the first people to come on. We're unknown. We went on TV with you. We went on this whole road with you. You came back with me. We're ready. I know you guys are in session and so on. You took the time out of your day. You even brought Scott to come and spend time with us. You've been a great mentor and a friend to me, and I appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Evan. I appreciate this opportunity.
If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.